At 0247 local time on the morning of the 19th of April 2026, in the North Arabian Sea, about 150 miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz, the captain of an Iranian container ship named the Touska was watching a problem develop on his radar that, 6 hours later, would become the defining moment of the United States naval blockade of Iran. He was running west at 17 knots, headed for the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas with a hold full of cargo that the U.S. Treasury Department had sanctioned twice already and would, by the end of the day, become a piece of evidence in an international incident. His vessel was 294 meters long. To put that in perspective, the USS Abraham Lincoln, an American Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, is 332 meters long. The Touska was, in scale, about the size of an American aircraft carrier with the top sliced off. She was flying the Iranian flag. She was on the U.S. Treasury Department's specially designated nationals list. Her ownership chain ran back through several shell companies based in port cities the U.S. State Department had been writing reports about for at least 4 years. She was, on paper, a ship that the United States had been waiting for an excuse to do something about for a very long time. The thing on her captain's radar was a Burke-class guided missile destroyer called the USS Spruance. The Spruance was 154 meters long, displaced a little over 9,000 tons fully loaded, and carried a 5-inch deck gun that, at the ranges involved, could put a precision-guided round into a single window on a single deck of a single ship. She was running parallel to the Touska. She was matching the Touska's course. She was, by international maritime convention, in international waters. And in roughly 6 hours, she was going to make the Touska famous. This is the story of what happened in those 6 hours, why it mattered, and how a single naval interception in the pre-dawn darkness of the Arabian Sea became the operational template that allowed the United States, over the following 2 weeks, to force the regime in Tehran into a position from which it could not climb out without giving up almost everything it had spent 40 years building. To understand why the Touska mattered, you have to understand what the United States Navy had been trying to accomplish in the Persian Gulf for the previous 6 days. On the 13th of April, 2026, U.S. Central Command announced that, effective immediately, American naval forces would be enforcing a blockade of Iranian ports and coastal areas. The blockade was a direct response to Iran's own asymmetric blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which had been in effect since the closing weeks of Operation Epic Fury, the U.S. air campaign that had spent most of February, March, and early April systematically dismantling Iran's conventional military infrastructure. Iran's blockade of Hormuz worked through fast attack craft and drones rather than warships, because by April 12th, the Iranian Navy had ceased to exist as a meaningful surface force. American airstrikes had destroyed most of Iran's frigates, corvettes, and missile boats, leaving the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy with a fleet of Bohammer-class fast boats, repurposed civilian dhows, and a swarm of one-way attack drones that, collectively, were enough to make the Strait of Hormuz too dangerous for commercial shipping to transit on any predictable schedule. Insurance rates for tankers and bulk carriers passing through the strait had spiked to levels not seen since the Iran-Iraq tanker war of the 1980s. By mid-April, on a typical day, somewhere between 125 and 140 commercial vessels would normally pass through the strait, carrying roughly 20% of the world's seaborne crude oil and a substantial fraction of its liquefied natural gas. By the second week of April, that number had collapsed to single digits. Hundreds of vessels were riding at anchor inside the Persian Gulf, waiting for the security situation to clear. Brent crude was trading above $100 a barrel and climbing. The American gas pump price had hit a national average of $4.05 per gallon. Iran's strategy was working in the sense that it was producing exactly the kind of global economic pressure on the United States that the regime in Tehran believed would force a diplomatic concession. The strategy was also failing in a way that Tehran did not yet fully understand, because the United States had decided to respond not by lifting its sanctions, not by withdrawing from the region, but by stacking a second blockade on top of Iran's blockade and seeing whose economy could absorb the pain longer. The American blockade, as announced by CENTCOM on April 13th, was clear in its scope. Any vessel inbound to or outbound from an Iranian port in either the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman would be subject to U.S. interdiction. Vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to non-Iranian destinations would be left alone. The legal architecture relied on a combination of existing U.S. Treasury sanctions, executive orders related to weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, and the residual authorities CENTCOM had been operating under during Operation Epic Fury. The practical architecture was simpler. There were, on April 13th, 4 U.S. Navy surface combatants and 1 amphibious-ready group operating in the area, supplemented by maritime patrol aircraft out of Bahrain and a constant overhead picture from satellites and unmanned platforms. Over the first 6 days of the blockade, the Americans had intercepted 23 Iranian-flagged or Iranian-bound vessels. Every single one of them had complied with U.S. instructions. They had received radio warnings. They had been ordered to alter course or return to port. They had done so, sometimes after a brief negotiation, sometimes after a U.S. helicopter conducted a low pass over their bridge. None of them had been physically interfered with. The blockade, in its first week, was working through the implicit threat of force rather than the actual application of it. The Iranian government was, by the morning of April 19th, beginning to understand the seriousness of what was happening. In Tehran, the parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf, who was also serving as Iran's chief negotiator for the talks scheduled to take place in Pakistan that same week, had appeared on Iranian state television with a statement that captured the regime's position with surprising honesty. He said, in effect, that if Iran could not transit the Strait of Hormuz, no one would. The threat was clear. Iran's response to the American blockade was to tighten its own stranglehold on the strait until the global economic pressure on the United States and its allies forced Washington to back down. The strategy had a fundamental problem that the Iranians, in their public messaging, had not yet fully addressed. Iran needed to sell oil far more urgently than the United States needed to buy it. The American blockade was costing Iran somewhere between $400 million and $500 million per day in lost export revenue, depending on which estimate you used. The Iranian blockade of Hormuz was costing American consumers higher gas prices. Those two pressures were not symmetric. One of them was driving an entire national economy toward collapse. The other was driving an unpopular news cycle. The question, on the morning of April 19th, was whether the Iranian regime understood the asymmetry well enough to back down before the American pressure forced an outcome neither side could control. The Touska was about to provide the answer. The container ship had departed an Iranian-friendly port some days earlier, transited eastward into the Indian Ocean, and was now running back westward to Bandar Abbas with a cargo manifest the United States considered a violation of standing sanctions. CENTCOM had been tracking her through commercial maritime data and naval surveillance for several days. The decision to interdict her, rather than simply log her transit and add the data to the sanctions case, was made at some point during the night of April 18th or the early morning hours of April 19th. The exact decision chain has not been declassified. What is publicly known is that sometime before 0300 local on April 19th, the USS Spruance was ordered to close on the Touska's position and execute the standard interdiction protocol the U.S. Navy had been using for the previous 6 days. The Spruance closed. She came alongside on a parallel course at a distance of roughly 2,000 yards, well inside the visual range of both vessels. Her bridge crew opened a UHF radio channel to the Touska on the standard international hailing frequencies. The first warning was issued at approximately 0300 local. The Spruance's communications officer, speaking in English, identified his vessel as a United States Navy warship, identified the Touska by name and IMO number, informed her captain that he was in violation of the U.S. naval blockade of Iran, and ordered him to alter course away from his destination and return to international waters east of the blockade line. The Touska did not reply. She did not alter course. She continued at 17 knots toward Bandar Abbas. 20 minutes later, the Spruance issued the second warning. The language escalated. The Touska's captain was informed that failure to comply would result in the boarding and seizure of his vessel. The Touska did not reply. She did not alter course. The third warning was issued at approximately 0400 local. By this point, the Spruance's radar was tracking the Touska continuously, and a flight of helicopters from the USS Tripoli, the amphibious assault ship operating in support of the blockade, had been placed on alert. The fourth warning was issued at 0500, the fifth at 0600, the sixth at 0700. By the time the sun came up over the Arabian Sea on the morning of April 19th, the Touska had been under continuous radio warning from the USS Spruance for approximately 4 hours. She had not responded. She had not slowed. She had not turned. The American escalation procedure, as practiced over the previous 6 days, had run out of room. What happened next is the part of the story that, in the public version, gets condensed into a Trump tweet. The reality, as later confirmed by CENTCOM in its official statement, was a precision firing solution that the U.S. Navy had been training for since at least the tanker war of the 1980s, but had not actually executed against a non-military Iranian vessel in the entire history of the modern US-Iran confrontation. The USS Spruance's primary surface armament is a 127mm Mark 45 Mod 4 deck gun, a 5-inch naval rifle capable of firing roughly 20 rounds per minute out to a maximum range of around 13 nautical miles, with precision-guided ammunition that can place a single round inside a circle a few meters wide at typical engagement distances. The gun was designed, originally, for shore bombardment and surface engagements against light combatants. It was not designed for the surgical disabling of a container ship. It was, on the morning of April 19th, going to do that job anyway. At approximately 0900 local, after a final radio warning that informed the Touska that her propulsion system was about to be disabled, the Spruance fired. The round was specifically targeted at the Touska's engine room, located in the standard position for a container ship of her type, in the aftermost section of the hull beneath the bridge superstructure. The round penetrated the hull, detonated inside the machinery space, and disabled the main propulsion. The Touska began to coast on her remaining momentum. Within minutes, she was no longer making meaningful headway. She was, in technical terms, dead in the water. She was also, importantly, still floating, still structurally intact, and still operationally recoverable. The American firing solution had been calibrated to break the ship's legs without breaking her back. This is harder than it sounds. It requires a degree of confidence in the precision of one's own ammunition, in the accuracy of one's intelligence about the target's internal compartmentation, and in the disciplined willingness of one's gunnery officers to hit exactly the right spot and not a slightly wrong one. The Spruance did all three. The Touska sat motionless on the morning sea, smoke rising from her engine room. Her crew presumably gathered on the deck, wondering what was about to happen next. What was about to happen next had been launched, under cover of the pre-dawn warnings, from the deck of the USS Tripoli, some miles to the south. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit had been embarked aboard the Tripoli for several months as part of the standard U.S. Indo-Pacific rotation. The MEU's air combat element included MV-22 Ospreys, AH-1Z attack helicopters, and the heavy-lift CH-53 Super Stallion. The boarding party for the Touska operation was inserted by helicopter, with the Marines fast roping from the cabin doors onto the Touska's deck, while the helicopters held their positions in a hover. CENTCOM later released a grainy video of the boarding, shot from one of the helicopters, that showed Marines in body armor descending on ropes onto a deck stacked high with shipping containers. The ship was not actively resisting. The Iranian crew, by the time the Marines reached the bridge, had complied with the boarding party's instructions to gather in a designated area and surrender their weapons, of which there were apparently very few. The Marines secured the bridge, the engine room, the radio shack, and the cargo holds. They detained the captain. They detained the crew. They confirmed that the ship was no longer under Iranian operational control. They reported the operation complete. The total elapsed time from the Spruance's first radio warning to the moment the Marines reported the Touska secured was approximately 6 hours. CENTCOM's official press release was published shortly after, with photographs of the boarding operation attached. President Trump posted on Truth Social roughly 2 hours later, with the now famous line about the U.S. Navy stopping the Touska right in her tracks by blowing a hole in her engine room. The post was, in its own way, an accurate description of what had just happened. The 5-inch round from the Spruance had, indeed, blown a hole in the Touska's engine room. The hole had, indeed, stopped her in her tracks. The post did not mention the 6 hours of warnings, the precision of the firing solution, the helicopter insertion of the Marines, the careful calibration of force required to disable a ship without sinking her or killing her crew. Those details were left for the trade publications and the maritime intelligence community to fill in. The political message was simpler. The United States Navy had, for the first time in this war, applied direct kinetic force against a non-military Iranian vessel. The blockade was no longer hypothetical. The blockade had teeth. The Iranian response was immediate and predictable in its rhetoric, and unpredictable in its actual operational consequences. Khatam al-Anbiya, Iran's top joint military command, denounced the boarding as a violation of the existing US-Iran ceasefire and as an act of maritime aggression. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghai called the seizure piracy. Tasnim news agency, the IRGC-affiliated outlet, ran statements promising retaliation. Iran's first vice president, Mohammad Reza Aref, appeared on television to deliver a statement that paired threats with an oblique offer of de-escalation. The choice, he said, was clear: either a free oil market for everyone or high costs for everyone. Stability in global fuel prices, in his framing, depended on a guaranteed end to the economic and military pressure against Iran and its allies. The framing was a tell. Iran was, in effect, asking the United States to lift its blockade in exchange for Iran lifting its own. The two sides had stacked their blockades on top of each other, and Tehran was now publicly conceding that the resulting global economic pressure was something it wanted to find a way to resolve. The American side did not respond directly to the offer. The blockade continued. Within 24 hours of the Touska seizure, every other Iranian vessel that had been steaming toward the strait or transiting east through it had received the same message that the Touska had ignored, and almost all of them had behaved differently. Compliance rates with U.S. naval warnings, which had already been high in the first week of the blockade, became effectively universal in the days that followed. The Touska had served as the demonstration shot. By the end of the third week of the blockade, CENTCOM was reporting that the U.S. had forced 45 commercial vessels to turn around, intercepted dozens more, and seized at least one stateless tanker, the M.T. Tiffany, that had been linked to Iranian oil smuggling and had loaded its cargo from Iran's Karg Island terminal earlier in the month. The Department of Defense's interim assessment, released around May 1st, calculated that Iran had lost approximately $4.8 billion in oil revenue between April 13th and May 1st as a direct consequence of the blockade. Some 31 tankers carrying roughly 53 million barrels of Iranian oil were stuck inside the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go and no buyers willing to take the legal risk of receiving them. The economic figures were staggering. They were also, in a sense, the easy part of the problem the regime in Tehran was now facing. The harder part was domestic. Iran had entered the war with an economy that was already in deep trouble. Inflation had been running above 50% annualized for most of 2025. The rial had lost something close to 60% of its value in the second half of 2025 alone. Food inflation had reached 64% in October and was running well above 100% on staples like bread and cereals by the time the US blockade began. Unemployment was rising, real incomes were falling, and the regime had spent the first 2 months of the year suppressing widespread street protests that had killed an estimated 30,000 people, according to one Guardian investigation, before being put down by IRGC and Basij security forces. The economic situation in March of 2026 was, in other words, already approaching the point at which an Iranian government in any other circumstance would have faced a fundamental political crisis. The U.S. blockade, layered on top of all of this, was now removing the single largest source of foreign currency the regime had left. Oil exports had been the difference between economic crisis and economic collapse. The blockade was eliminating oil exports. The math, as understood by retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery in interviews he gave to American outlets in late April, suggested that Iran had perhaps 3 to 4 weeks of operational tolerance before its oil storage facilities filled to capacity, forcing the regime to either shut down active wells, with all the long-term reservoir damage that implied, or cut domestic refining and risk fuel shortages on top of food shortages. Other analysts, including the editorial team at the Jerusalem Post in mid-April, gave the regime perhaps 3 months. The range of estimates was wide, but the direction was unanimous. Iran was running out of time. Trump, in a series of social media posts in late April, declared Iran to be in a state of collapse and indicated to his aides, according to Wall Street Journal reporting, that he was prepared to maintain the blockade indefinitely. The Iranian regime, watching its export revenues evaporate, watching its currency continue to fall, watching its food prices continue to rise, watching the same population that had taken to the streets in December and January grow daily more restive, began to make offers it would not have dreamed of making 3 months earlier. By April 28th, Tehran had publicly proposed lifting its own blockade of the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for the Americans lifting theirs. The proposal would, however, have left Iran's nuclear program intact. Trump rejected it. The blockade continued. The Touska, by this point, was sitting in a U.S.-controlled port somewhere in the region, her captain in detention. Her cargo manifest being inventoried by Treasury Department investigators, her hull hold a piece of evidence in a case that would take years to fully prosecute. The damage she had absorbed in her engine room from the Spruance's 5-inch round was being assessed by U.S. Navy salvage personnel. She was, in operational terms, a one-time piece of demonstration ordnance. The point she had been used to make had already been made. The point was this: Iran had bet, in the spring of 2026, that asymmetric pressure on the global oil market would force the United States to back down before the asymmetric pressure on its own economy forced Iran to back down. The bet was rational, in the sense that any superpower confrontation with a regional power tends to favor the regional power's tolerance for pain over the superpower's tolerance for political fallout. The bet was wrong, in the specific sense that the United States had decided, this time, that it was willing to absorb the political fallout of higher gas prices for as long as Iran was willing to absorb the economic damage of the blockade. The Touska was the moment at which the asymmetry became unmistakable. A single 5-inch round, fired from a guided missile destroyer at a sanctioned container ship 6 hours after the first warning, demonstrated that the United States was prepared to escalate force in increments calibrated precisely to the level needed to make a point, and that no further escalation was required because the point had already been made. By the time President Trump met President Xi Jinping in Beijing on May 14th, the blockade had been in effect for 1 month. Iran had lost north of $4.8 billion in oil revenue. The regime had publicly proposed terms it would have rejected outright 6 weeks earlier, and the political calculation in Tehran had begun, slowly and reluctantly, to shift. The shift would not be total. It might not be permanent. It might still, in some scenarios, lead to the kind of outcome that nobody on either side wanted. But it would not have happened without the Touska. 6 hours of warnings, 1 precision-guided round into an engine room, a fast rope insertion of Marines from a hovering helicopter, and a press release with grainy video that the President of the United States used to make his point on social media became the operational template that, by early May, had broken Iran's strategy and put the regime in front of a choice it had spent decades trying to avoid. The captain of the Touska, when he finally identified himself to the Marines who had taken his bridge, remains anonymous in the public record. He had presumably been told, by someone in Tehran, to ignore the American warnings and continue to Bandar Abbas. He had complied with that order. The order had been wrong. The wrongness of the order, in a regime that prized loyalty to bad orders above almost any other operational virtue, was a piece of information that the Iranian leadership was, by the end of April, finally beginning to absorb. The Touska had been built to carry containers. She had ended up carrying a message instead. The message had been delivered. The blockade continued. Iran ran out of time before the United States ran out of patience. And the war that had begun with airstrikes in February of 2026 was, by the spring, being decided by something quieter and more inexorable: a guided missile destroyer, a 6-hour countdown, and a single round into the right compartment.